My brother Connor sat across from me at our mother's kitchen table 4 months after. He had quietly copied my business plan and launched his own version of it 3 states away. And he said, "Maddie, I think we should finally talk about what happened." And I said, "I think you're right, Connor." And what Connor did not know sitting at that table was that the version of my business he had copied was not actually my real business. It was a version I had specifically built to be copied because 8 months earlier I had figured out exactly what Connor was doing. And instead of confronting him, I had decided to let him take the bait, and the bait had a flaw built into it. So precisely that Connor had spent the last 4 months running a company that was structurally guaranteed to hit a wall, and he had just hit it. And that was why he was sitting at our mother's table asking to talk. And I folded my hands and I said, "Okay, Connor, let's talk. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And if this is your first time here, oh, I am so glad this is the story you're starting with, because this one took me almost a full year to execute. And watching it land was honestly one of the most satisfying moments of my professional life. My name is Madeline Voss, and I am 31 years old, and I run a specialty food packaging consultancy that I built from nothing over 6 years. And my brother Connor is 28 and has had a pattern, going back to childhood, of watching what I build and quietly attempting his own version of it slightly faster and slightly louder. And the business plan situation was simply the most expensive iteration of a pattern I had been watching my entire life. The pattern started small, the way these things always do, with things like Connor joining the same college club I had joined 2 years earlier and telling people he had discovered it independently, and Connor learning the guitar after watching me struggle through lessons for a year, and then performing at a family gathering as though guitar had always been his thing. And these were small enough that I had absorbed them as quirks of sibling dynamics rather than warning signs. Until 18 months ago when Connor started asking very specific questions about my consultancy, questions about my client acquisition process, and my pricing model, and my supplier relationships, questions that were too detailed to be casual curiosity and too consistent to be coincidence. And I started paying close attention. About a year ago, I found out, through a mutual contact in the packaging industry, that Connor had registered an LLC with a name strikingly similar to mine and had begun reaching out to several of my actual clients with a pitch that was structurally almost identical to my own pitch, down to specific phrasing I recognized because I had written it myself. And I sat with that information for several days, deciding what to do. And the obvious option was to confront him directly. But I had watched Connor deflect and minimize every previous version of this pattern for years, and I did not believe confrontation would produce anything except Connor apologizing, adjusting his language slightly, and continuing the underlying behavior in a less detectable form. So I decided to do something different, which was build him a trap. And I want to be precise about what that means because it is not as dramatic as it sounds. What it actually meant was that I began deliberately sharing a modified version of my business model in places I knew Connor was watching. Specifically in a private industry forum I knew he monitored because he had mentioned it once without realizing I was also a member under a different username. And the modified version looked completely legitimate. It had a real pricing structure and a real supplier list and a real client acquisition strategy. But it had one core flaw embedded into the financial model, which was a margin structure that worked perfectly at small scale and became mathematically unsustainable once a business using it crossed roughly 40 clients. Because the supplier discount tiers I had listed were specifically reversed from the real ones, meaning that what looked like increasing efficiency at scale was actually decreasing margin at scale. And anyone copying the model exactly without independently verifying supplier terms would build a business that looked successful for the first year and then began quietly bleeding money the moment it grew past a certain size. Connor copied it almost exactly. And I know this because I tracked his company's public information the way any business owner tracks a competitor, watching his client list grow and his marketing language echo mine with specific phrases I had planted intentionally. And for the first year, his business looked genuinely successful. He signed new clients. He posted enthusiastically about growth. And at a family Thanksgiving 10 months ago, he made a toast about building something of his own. And I sat there and said nothing and ate my dinner because I knew exactly where his numbers were going to be in another 6 months, and I was willing to wait the wall came exactly when the math predicted it would. Around the 42 client mark, when Connor's margins began contracting, in a way his own bookkeeping could not explain because the structural flaw was buried in supplier. Discount assumptions he had simply copied from my forum post without independently verifying with his own supplier contacts. And by month 10, he was hemorrhaging money on his largest contracts specifically, the ones that should have been most profitable under a correctly structured model. And Connor, who had built his entire identity around being faster and louder than me, was now facing a business that was structurally failing in a way he did not understand and could not explain to the investors he had brought in, two of whom were family friends who had trusted him, partly because the business resembled mine so closely. Connor called our mother first, not me, and told her he was having unexplained financial trouble, and our mother, who genuinely did not know the history between Connor's company and mine in any detail, suggested he talk to me because I clearly know packaging finance better than anyone she knows. And that suggestion is how Connor ended up at her kitchen table across from me 4 months ago, asking if we could finally talk about what happened. And I want to be honest that there was a version of this where I simply told him plainly what I had done and let the trap speak entirely for itself. But I decided instead to let him explain his version first, and Connor sat there and said, Maddie, I think when I started my company, I modeled it a little too closely on yours, and I should have talked to you first, and I want to understand what went wrong because nothing makes sense on paper. And I said, Connor, walk me through your supplier discount tiers, and he did. And I watched him read me numbers that were the exact reverse numbers I had planted, and I let him finish. And then I said, Connor, those numbers are inverted from how supplier discounts actually scale in this industry. Did you verify them independently with your own supplier contacts, or did you take them from somewhere? And Connor went very quiet. And then he said I found a detailed breakdown online a couple years ago that matched what you'd told me about your business before. And I said, Connor, did it occur to you that information posted publicly by someone who knew you were watching might not be the real information? Connor's face went through several stages in about 4 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked very close to genuine shock. And he said, you knew I was watching. And I said, Connor, I have known you were copying my work since college. I just finally decided to stop pretending I hadn't noticed. And he said, you let me build an entire company on bad numbers. And I said, I built information that anyone doing independent due diligence would have caught immediately. Connor, the flaw was findable. You would have found it if you had verified anything, instead of copying everything. And he sat there for a long time not saying anything. And our mother, who had been quietly making tea in the next room and clearly heard most of this, came in and set 2 cups down and said nothing and left again, which I think was her way of saying she understood more than either of us realized. I did not help Connor restructure his business, and I want to be honest about that because I think people watching this might expect a softer ending where I rescue him, and I considered it genuinely, but I decided that rescuing him from the consequences of a pattern he had been running his entire life would simply teach him that the pattern always eventually gets cleaned up by someone else. And instead, I told him I would be happy to recommend him to an independent consultant, someone with no relationship to either of us, who could do an honest assessment of his actual numbers. And he took that recommendation, and he is, as far as I know, still working through restructuring his business with that consultant's help, on his own, without copying anyone's homework. And Connor and I talk now, carefully, more honestly than we ever have before. And at Christmas this year, he asked me a genuine question about my supplier relationships, and then said, and I mean actually asked you this time, and I laughed and I told him the real answer, because some lessons only need to be taught once if they are taught completely. And I think Connor finally understands that the version of success that comes from watching someone else closely, enough to copy them, will always eventually run into the parts of the picture you cannot see from the outside. And I am genuinely glad he is rebuilding something real now, slower, on his own foundation. Because the version of my brother sitting across from me at Christmas, asking real questions ends.